Hello, hello. I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves. So let's go ahead in order. Let's start with Torrin.
Hey everybody, hey Sabby, my name is Torrin Walker. I am a writer, I'm a journalist, I'm a content creator. I'm also a digital filmmaker. So that's pretty much what I do. I tell black stories and I tell the stories of marginalized people.
Awesome. And Garland.
Garland Nixon. I'm a YouTube host, radio host, actually retired law enforcement. I was in, I've done a lot of radio going back and forth with conservatives, and I was on Fox News for about 10 years.
And Jamal.
Jamal Thomas. I am a YouTuber, content creator at this point, former radio host, I suppose, maybe future radio host. But Jamal Thomas Morning Show, 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. on YouTube currently.
Yes, and Jamal gets up very early.
Unfortunately, yes.
Hey, I applaud it. I applaud it. But we want to get things started off today because everyone obviously on this panel has experience in the media. All of them are independent now, but even at some point, and we'll start with you, Torrin, we want to talk about people's experiences that they've had. And this conversation kind of comes from the firing of Joy Reid. There are a number of people that, feel some type of way about it. There seems to be a pattern that is happening with MSNBC, but I don't think this is just an issue with MSNBC. And I've gave my opinion about Joy Reid. But Torrin, I want to start with you. A lot of people may not be aware, but Torrin was the first guest that I had on this show. And I remember, Torrin, in the beginning, you were explaining about the experience that you had working with like the Huffington Post. So I want to hear a little bit about that. If you could explain to people why you decided to, exit that and go into independent media.
Yeah, well, my professional background started at the Huffington Post. I was filing stories in the midst of everything that was going on during the new protest movement, the George Floyd, the Mike Browns, all those stories that were happening when unfortunately it seemed like there was another black brother getting killed by the police like every other week. So I was filing those stories. And while it was good professionally at first, what I ran up against in mainstream media was the fact that there's a difference between telling a story and the way a story is framed and having to move that story through an editorial process when you're dealing with people who may not understand the culture and they may not understand the background of why things happen the way they happen. So while, of course, when you're working in mainstream media, or really if you're working in professional media in general, you're going to deal with an editorial process. But I think sometimes people don't understand that sometimes the editorial process can affect the way a story is portrayed, even no matter what information you present. So that was dealing with a lot of that. And then when I left the Huffington Post, I freelanced around for a lot of different outlets for Fusion, a couple of things on Vice, and I ran up against that same thing because my background and my beat was telling black stories from black perspectives. That doesn't mean that you're being biased from one or the other, but I'm just giving you the stories from people who may not normally be heard. So what I dealt with constantly was people who may not know the culture, people who may not understand the nuance, ironically, or the context of a culture. So I ended up having to deal with it all the time. It's like, was the story relevant? How come you're talking about these people? Why aren't you talking about other people? So I eventually just got tired of it, and I just left it. Eventually, we had a parting of the ways, and I built my own thing, so to speak.
Awesome. Let's go to Garland here. So Garland, I know that you used to work with Fox News for quite some time. What was your experience? I'm curious. You got to be honest, Garland. What was your experience like working for Fox News during that time? And is there any difference that you see when you look at Fox News today?
Well, I don't look at Fox News today, so I don't see a difference. But in reality, a big part of it was my journey, because when I started with Fox, I was a Democrat, and they used to say Garland Nixon, Democratic strategist. And what I realized in the past is, the mainstream media wants to set up a particular paradigm. Here's the Democrat with the mainstream Democrat position. Here's a Republican with the mainstream Republican position, and let the two go at it. But I was a Democrat. I didn't know, and then the whole Bernie thing happened, and I started to change and drift away from the Democratic Party. And eventually I was on Fox, national, and I started doing a TV show it was in New York and Philly and Jersey, in that area, right? It was called Chasing News. And at a point, what's interesting has happened is it got to a point where I started hosting the show. They were like, "Oh yeah, we like you." I was kind of, I guess, moving up. That's whatever you want to call it. And when the host was not, if he was off, I would host the show. And I started reading from a teleprompter. I lasted 60 days and quit. Once I started reading from a teleprompter, it was like, hey, that I didn't, as long as they were like, what do you think, Garland? Boom, and I could tell them. But when it got to the point I'm reading from a teleprompter, I'm like, that's not me. Then I'm interviewing someone, and the questions are given to me. I'm going to ask them the following questions. I read the questions. I'm like, oh, hell no, I'm supposed to ask that, And so it just got to a point where it wasn't me, and I just walked away. And then, of course, I went back, and I always did some radio, and I went back all into my radio and stuff like that. So my eye changed. And then once I actually started reading from a teleprompter, I just couldn't do it. I can't say things that I don't believe.
We're going to come back around to that. Jamal, your journey is a little bit different because I remember watching you like way before I started the show, your YouTube channel, and this was during the Bernie days. And I thought your show was a little bit different. Like you were still obviously, supporting Bernie and things like that. But I felt like you gave a deeper analysis than what I saw from some of the other, channels that were supporting Bernie during that time. But then you went to work for Sputnik Radio. And please explain to everybody what happened there. Because for those who don't know, Jamal used to host a show with Sputnik called Fault Lines. It was an awesome show. That was probably like my favorite show to be a part of, like on a regular, like you guys had great conversations over there, and everybody wasn't from the same political ideology, but all three of you could come together and just have like a genuine conversation. What happened with your journey?
Oh God, man, I feel like I'm fortunate than these two, because I really didn't get pushed. Like, when I was doing my own channel, it was my own channel. I talked about, if I wanted to talk about Star Trek, I talk about Star Trek. If I want to talk about politics, I talk about politics. The radio station radicalized me, weirdly enough. And what I mean by that is, on my own channel, I used to focus mostly on domestic politics. And by the time I got to the radio station, God, man, we did international politics. That's what we did. Like we were doing media sources all around the world. One day we were talking about Sudan, another day we were talking about Pakistan, another day we're talking about Nord Stream pipeline. And it was at the station where I realized how extreme U.S. policy is. And it radicalized me. I just couldn't, like, my mom instilled certain values in me, right? And war is bad, killing is bad, knocking over governments is bad. All of these things are bad. And then when you really dig into it and you're looking at this stuff from an international standpoint, you realize how extreme and over the top, in addition to the propaganda associated with the policy in order to justify the previous, is. I was outraged. I was like, I can't believe this is the way the world works. It's the way the world works, right? I didn't get the sense of being pushed. I mean, for all intents and purposes, their thing was, we want you to get the story right. And by get it right, I just mean you need to report it straight, report it honest. It doesn't need to align with mainstream media. Give it the way you perceive it. And you have people who are on the right, on the left, you have communists, you have libertarians, you have everybody, in between where you guys have fights with. And that stuff on some level informs your point of view. There's some points of view where you're like, you're absolutely right, I'm wrong. There are other points of view where you get into a drag out fight on air over whatever that particular issue is. So it's a weird journey. I mean, I started off as a software engineer and then started off in media. I look at the world through this kind of engineering logic and chess logic. And somewhere along the way, it just kind of fell ass backwards into a media job for my YouTube channel. So it's a weird journey. It's a weird journey, to put it mildly. But thank you. I appreciate your compliment on that.
And what happened with fault lines? Because the government got involved there, didn't they?
Yes. So yes. So the government did an end run around the First Amendment. And what they ended up doing was they said initially going after banks. And they were doing this for conservatives too, by the way, where they were going after banks. The people are lying if they're saying they weren't doing it. They were debanking people. I mean, they were doing it in Canada, they were doing it in the UK. But what they ended up doing was starting to put a pressure on the show. And some of that had to do with audits. Some of it had to do with going so far as to say, okay, we're going to go after the parent companies. And by going after the parent companies, you can basically strangulate. Strangulation. Yeah, you can strangulate. That sounds wrong. You can choke to death, choke the hell out of the show. by basically killing it up top, and you kill everything that goes downstream, and it makes it illegal. The company tried to stay open. A boss told us beforehand, he was like, look, they would have to come in and rip the cord out the socket before we effectively call it a day. And ultimately, it was boiled down to the lawyers came in one day and says, you will go to jail. Stop. In which case, stop on a dime. So it's a weird experience to have the federal government target you. Like you're saying something so subversive that they need to shut you down. That is mind-blowing, right? And this kind of informs my opinion about the Joy Ann Reid thing. Joy Ann Reid was one of those people, as opposed to media solidarity, where everybody's like, all right, we may have different points of view, but all of us are media, we're going to defend each other because all of us are media. If one goes down, everybody goes down. That is not the way MSNBC looked at that. MSNBC thought it was fine. They were dancing on our graves.
Well,
Joy Ann Reid.
Hold on to that, because we'll get to the Joy Reid part. So hold that thought for a second. I want to pivot back to what Garland said here about being given questions, and I'll go back to you, Torrin, and then back to Garland. This experience, and this is something I think a lot of us have criticized corporate media about, because I don't believe that these commentators are choosing their own questions. I don't believe that they're not being told by producers what they can and cannot talk about. And I'm curious with you, Torrin, even when you were writing, the experiences that you had, you said there were certain stories that you wanted to cover, but you were getting that pushback about, well, they didn't feel that it was important. Was there ever a time when you were told what you needed to discuss?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah.
I was never told what to discuss, but what happened to me a couple of times was that I had back and forth with editors where it was like, we're going to edit this in a certain way till the voice you're trying to reach in the story and the voice you're trying to give in the story is not the voice we're going to print out. I'll give you an example. In the aftermath of the Charleston massacre, when Dylan Ruth came in there and killed all those black people in the church, I wrote a story called He's Not Heavy, He's Not Evil, He's Your Creation. And I was basically saying that Dylan Roof is not an isolated case. What he is the product of 400 years of anti-blackness filtered in through the modern day, given access to weaponry and given access to unfettered access to the internet, where this would eventually take place, and not this way and another way. And when I put that story out, or when I submitted it, I had to deal with a lot of editorial pushback about, well, do you think you want to say this way? Or how about if we go back and say it this way? Why don't you do this and why don't you do that? I don't want to get into the full details of it, but that's what happens a lot of the time. So they don't directly come and tell you that, we want you to say this. There's a way to edit a story, and there's a way to create a narrative that says something completely different than what you're trying to convey. So I never had anybody tell me directly, don't do this, but I do know that it does go on. I know that a lot of people who are in mainstream media, they're really not journalists. They're really just news readers, and they're given what to say, and they just repeat it. And as long as they have a job, they're fine, and they'll do that as long as it's comfortable to them. And the minute they get fired, then all of a sudden they want to come and be independent. But that's a whole other conversation. We'll get into that later.
Thank you, Torrin. Garland, so going back to what you said about you were given questions. Could you expand on that just a little bit more? Because when I think of people like Simone Sanders, for example, and when we saw, like during the 2024 presidential election, it was very obvious that there's bias on both sides, right? Like there's bias on Fox News towards Donald Trump. There's bias on MSNBC and CNN towards Kamala Harris, and then previously Joe Biden. Do you think that even when we looked at some of like those the third party candidates, remember it was like a hush thing, like don't talk about it, or because of what was happening in Gaza, they felt like they had to mention it at least because they knew some people were leaning that way. So they're like, oh, well, if you support Jill Stein, then that's just a vote for Donald Trump, that type of thing. When you say that you were given questions or you were told like what to do, how far does that go?
Sure. Now, keep in mind that when I'm talking about more of a, I don't want to call it a local show, but the ones that wasn't the national stuff. And I'm interviewing people and stuff. It was like written out. You know what I mean? Like the questions and stuff were written out that I would either have to memorize them, read them off of a teleprompter or something like that. Now, I'll say this. When you get to the national stuff, the host of the show will read out like the intros to a segment, right? Like Marco Rubio today said blah 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 and this and that and that. And you can tell they're doing the intro, right? But then when they get to the actual kind of talking, editorializing part of the show, then it's not written out the same way. I'll say this though, I can recall one time, I've had this happen more than once. So when I was, let's say I'm going to do a show in New York, right? I'm on the train and they would email me, this is what we're going to talk about. Block A, this, blah, blah, blah. Send me your talking points. And I had twice. One time I was going to New York and send me your talking points. I sent him my talking points. And I knew I was green then though. I didn't know. Send him my talking points. I get to New York. I get a call. Yeah, we'll probably do things a little different today. We're not going to need you, but look, the limo's there that was supposed to take me to the station. Just use it all evening and do whatever you want. Manhattan, it's all yours, and have a fun, whatever, right? Really. And so what they would do is if they didn't use you, they just give you the limo for the rest of the evening and say use it for whatever you wanted. Who cares, right? Like that's the consolation prize. But what I learned was, after a while, I learned just put whatever you will. Just put something for the talking points that you think they'll approve. And then when you get on the air, talk about whatever you want. So it appeared to me that the talking points must have went upstairs to somebody or went to, the people in charge, and they looked at the talking points. Whoa, no, this ain't going to go down. But I did find that it didn't matter what I put on the talking points. Nobody ever said, once I went on the air and said whatever I wanted to say, hey, that's not the same as your talking points. But there is some editorial approval going on, but it appeared that I could kind of say what I wanted,
That's it. That's
surprised, yeah. I would say Fox, as far as being, just not the host, but as being the person that's on the show where they're talking to you and asking you stuff and all. It wasn't. But then again, at that time, I was a Democrat. I was in the Democratic Party. And as I got to the Bernie stuff, I drifted further away from being a Democrat, so I didn't fit in the mold as well. But still, they never messed with me. They let me do what I wanted to do. I will say that.
That's interesting. And that brings me to the Joy Reid piece. Because for those who are not aware, Bree was going to be on this panel tonight, but she wasn't able to come. She had another appointment. But her article was published in Current Affairs, this recent article about Joy Reid. And I want you guys to see something. I mentioned this before on the show, but for those who have not seen it, Bree also wrote it. People need to hear this part right here. For example, I suspect that Reid was willing to risk covering Palestine because, like many Black Americans, myself included, she sees Palestinian apartheid reflected in her own experience as a minority in a settler colonial country, and the stakes are clear. I applaud her for taking that risk. But I was also told by a person with knowledge that a booker who used to find guests for Reid's show said that after they suggested me as a guest, Reid no longer wanted to work with them. And there's another part I want to come to after this. So long story short, basically, Brianna Joy Gray was suggested as a guest on Joy Reid's show. I believe this was during the Bernie 2020 campaign. And apparently the booker who wanted to bring her on was removed after that. So it was very clear there was some type of blacklist that was going on. And keep in mind, people, that obviously Bernie was running through the Democratic Party, but he wasn't the type of Democrat I think that corporate media wanted. I want to pass it to you, Jamal, your thoughts about that and this whole idea of blacklist. And I think you and Garland are close to DC.
Yeah, I'm right outside of DC.
Yeah, I used to live in DC for the last 5 years. Yeah.
There seems to be like this DC elite media bubble as well. Go ahead, Jamal.
So I had Ted Rall on my show, and Ted Rall, I didn't know this, but Ted Rall used to, at one point, was trying to get a job at MSNBC. And they effectively told him, look, you can't criticize Democrats. And Ted Rall was like, how can you do the job like that? And by the same token, he pointed out that Rachel Maddow, he said she's the biggest fraud on the planet, that she's every bit as much of a lefty as him and I are. And yet she plays that particular role on MSNBC. You can look at Ed Schultz, if you remember Ed Schultz saying that he believed he got fired from MSNBC for trying to cover Bernie Sanders. They kept telling him, don't cover Sanders, don't cover Sanders. He kept trying, in which case they got rid of him. Krista Ball, I remember she said she did a segment on Hillary Clinton where she was critical of Hillary Clinton, and they effectively gave her a reminder after the fact saying, yeah, let's have this person check his stories. Effectively, that's a no-no. We don't like that you did that. And Cenk Uygur, if you remember, Cenk Uygur had a show on MSNBC, and he pointed out that they brought him into the room saying, hey, you're being too tough on Democrats. Like, there's obviously a slant in regards to what they can and they cannot necessarily cover. Gaza was one of those issues. And the reason why I say Gaza was one of those issues, I don't know if it was specifically related to Israel or if it was specifically related to criticism of the Democratic Party. I don't know which one it is. It could be both. Because if you remember, part of the criticism towards Democrats were Genocide Joe, Chiller Kamala. You guys are backing a genocide. How are you backing a genocide and expect people to vote for you in good faith? And that was a criticism. You guys are backing a genocide. You guys are backing a genocide. And so if you're on MSNBC, and when they wouldn't even bring a Palestinian on the DNC convention stage, and you are Joy-Ann Reid or somebody else, and you're bringing up this issue of Gaza, okay, well, obviously, Joe Biden is in office. Any criticism of the Israel issue is by definition a criticism of the Biden administration, considering 70 to 80% of the money that Israel is using for that genocide was coming from Joe Biden. And this was something that Kamala Harris didn't want to count. This was something that she even told her people, don't talk to people if they're bringing this up. And so you can imagine if you are a network where criticism of the Democratic Party is effectively off the table in real terms, it is indirect criticism to bring up the issue of Israel and Gaza. Now, I don't know if it's indirect criticism of Democrats or if it's the fact that it's Israel and Gaza, because look, I can tell you, all of us in media were under some level of pressure when October 7th happened, where it was kind of like we were told, look, play this straight. Now, the rub is Israel went so far after the first week where it was like, okay, just do the news. Doing the news is effectively being critical at that point. But that was our network. Who knows what was going on at MSNBC? And I believe Brianna Joy Gray is right. It was probably either the criticism of Israel, the indirect criticism of the Democratic Party that effectively ran afoul. Good on Joy-Ann Reid for covering the issue in spite of the threat. But it was a threat to her job, and Lord knows they got rid of her.
Well, her ratings did decrease too. When I looked at the ratings, her ratings did drop. Now, granted, Al Sharpton's show was lower than hers.
Yeah,
so I didn't understand how he got to stay there, but she had to go. And I know she did give some credit, but I felt like her criticism about Israel was mild compared to those of us that went hard in the paint. I felt like hers was relatively mild. But this isn't the first time they tried to remove her. They tried to remove her a couple of years ago, and it was actually Sean Hannity who came in to kind of rescue her and save the day and say, no, keep her there.
Really?
Yeah. A lot of people I don't think know about that, but they tried to get rid of her a couple years ago. And there was turmoil back then at MSNBC, and Sean Hannity was the one who contacted them and said, don't get rid of Joy Reid. And she sent him a thank you. There's a whole article about this. I kid you not. If you Google it, like, she thanked him for letting her basically, keep her job.
That is hilarious.
I know. It's just like, I want to pass to you, Torrin, as well. I want to get your take on this about what Bree said, that she was basically, in so many words, blacklisted. And I'm assuming because she was working with the Bernie campaign.
Well, I was nodding my head while you were speaking because I have been down this road before myself. Word has gotten back to me a couple of times that I've been suggested to be on a couple of shows. And then when people started checking some of the things I talk about, they'd be like, no, don't bring him on. I've had it happen a couple of times. So this is nothing surprising. But I think people need to understand this. When you are a Black journalist and you're in the mainstream, there's sort of like this unofficial understanding that you're only going to talk about certain issues. You're going to talk about Black civil rights. You're going to talk about electoral politics in sort of like a roundabout way, but it has to be somewhat connected to the Democratic Party. And you have to talk about things that happen in world events, but on a very, very surface level. What happened over the past year and a half with Gaza and Israel is that we're seeing the combination of digital media, meeting mainstream media again for the second time in the last 10 years, meeting the narrative and meeting people's consciences. You can get into the thing about the influence that Israel and AIPAC and the lobby and what they have with mainstream media in the United States. But no matter how much influence you have, nothing's going to trump the fact that you have a father holding his dead child who's been blown apart in his arms in the midst of rubble. There's no way to spin that. There's no way to get around that. And I don't care where you are, if you have any kind of compassion for human beings, you're going to want to reach out to those people and figure out what's going on. If you're a journalist, it behooves you and it's incumbent on you to try to get a backstory on why is this happening? What's going on with this? It's not just it's not just the things happen on October 7th. What's the backstory that goes into this? And for the people who create narratives in the United States in mainstream media, that's very scary. And when you are a black person who's stepping out of that box, they put you in as a black journalist and you go into these stories, then automatically you become a target. I think that's what happened with Brianna. I think that's what happened with Joy to a degree. But there's also another thing that's going on as well. Fortunately, what happens a lot of times when some of our people get into these positions, they automatically get obsessed with being the only one in the room. You hear people talk about, so if we're going to have this conversation, we got to have it. A lot of our people who get into these spaces get into this thing where like, well, I'm here. I got to protect my position, and I'm not going to let anything come in here that's going to threaten me. So if you're making me look bad, you're making us all look bad. So I'm not going to have you on my show. Now, what happens, like I said earlier, is that everybody gets their wake-up call. Paul Mooney said it in a different way, but I'm not going to do it out of respect for your show. But a lot of times people get into these spaces and they forget that your first duty is to be a journalist, and your first duty as a journalist is to the truth. Even that sometimes at the expense of your position, sometimes at the expense of your comfortability. People forget that, and they think because they have an expense account and they're on TV every day, they think that automatically gives them a mandate. You still have to be able to inform the public. It's still on you to be able to take care of the people who want to be informed by you. And if you step outside of that, like I said, you run the risk of either your bosses coming down on you, but if you try to go along to get along, you end up losing the credibility that you built up with the people who respect you. So I think what happens is we have to figure out, do you want to be a journalist? Are you a journalist who is black? Or are you just somebody there who's holding a seat? Because if you're one or the other, you have to pick a side. You're going to have to decide, are you a journalist? Are you dedicated to telling the truth? Are you dedicated to informing people? Or what are you there for?
Ooh, that's deep. They're torn. And this brings up an experience I had when I was an undergrad. And at that time, I was just a sophomore, but I was starting to apply for internships for broadcast journalism. We were going to different like local news stations. This is local news, guys. So just keep in mind, guys, I wasn't in like going to like MSNBC or nothing like that, but these are like local news stations at the time. There was a woman who told me, and I kid you not, this will never get out of my head. There was a woman who told me, black woman, that said, if you want to be a TV anchor, she said, you need to try to get to a news station, a local news station that doesn't already have a black female anchor. And I was like, what? Like, I wasn't even, keep in mind the age at that time. Like I wasn't even 21 years old. And she told me that, and she was dead serious because she said they don't want another you. If they already have a black female anchor, they don't want another one. And I think that was like a big like reality check for me. Is like, holy smokes, is she serious? And then I started paying attention. Like when I watched like the local news and I was like, oh my God, I think she's right. Like they may have other people out in the field, like the field reporters. But when it came to the anchors, I think she had a point there. And that leads me to this part here that Bree said as well. Let me make sure. Give me just a second, because I think StreamYard added some new thing. So now it's like we got to do, I don't know why they made things more complicated than they already were. But now it's like if we're sharing something, we have to click on the scene thing. So I don't know. Can people see this? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, good. Because I think last time people couldn't see it. So something else that Bree said in this article here, and this gets to the part about Tiffany Cross. She said that, I'm going to highlight this. This is crazy. For the crime of being critical of the Democratic Party, encouraging Democrats to embrace the progressive issues popular among their base, like Medicare for all, I was told by party apparatus that I would never work in town again. Tiffany Cross likened me to Dave Chappelle character Clayton Bigsby, a white supremacist who's Black and said the quiet part out loud. Attention, younger people hoping to pursue a career in political communications. Calm work requires thinking, strategy, foresight, always uplifting the candidate. And then she went on to say, Tiffany is right. Career advancement in the Washington political scene and on corporate news requires always uplifting the candidate. And Garland, I want to bring you back in here. What is going on with this news political scene in DC? Like, this is crazy.
Well, it's reality. It's not news. I've been saying this for a while. Look, and Joy Reid knew the game. I mean, look, I don't feel sorry for her. She played the game until it didn't work for her anymore. You know what I mean? I've heard Joyce Reid say things that made me want to snatch the TV off the wall and heave it out the window. I mean, and I was like, she's disgusting. And now all of a sudden, people like that kill me. They're willing to do all the dirt for the system. And then when it don't work for them, they turn Black again all of a sudden. Right? Anybody to the left, oh, she attacked her. You're Bernie. Oh, you're a Russian bot. You know, everything she could, whatever the man told her, the establishment, the system, when they said attack, dog, attack, she would bite your ankles in half. And then all of a sudden, when suddenly things don't work out for her, oh, well, I'm Black again. Oh, Black people, come around. Well, please help me up. No, sorry, Joy. You just, your time, your usefulness is gone. Trump won. Here's what I think. Trump won. And now I remember when Joe Scarborough had this thing called Scarborough Country, right? And that was when the Bush administration was in, and he was a conservative. And then Obama won, and he wasn't a conservative anymore. He was still Joe Scarborough, but it wasn't Scarborough Country. And off he goes to claim it's a conservative. Now he's on the left, right? So you know why he wasn't a conservative anymore? Because they'd have fired him. As soon as Obama came in, if you remember, MSNBC, a bunch of these, MSNBC had conservatives. They had both. Obama comes in, they do a shift, and they bring in all they're Democrat. Trump won. They're going to get rid of some of these Joy Reid tap dancers who are tap dancing for the Democratic Party and bring somebody in to tap dance for the Republican Party and now say, well, you know, perhaps we were a little hasty being mean to Trump. They're playing the game. They're trying to get the ratings and save themselves. And so I don't feel sorry for Joy Reid. She got what she got. She played the game until it didn't work for her anymore. And now we're supposed to sit around and talk about how she's been done wrong because she was Black. But we see people talk about the system. You think, I put it like that. They wrote, oh, you had to uplift the candidate, the Democratic candidate. Joy Reid could have wrote that. She knew the game. She played it every day. Till it didn't work for her anymore. When it didn't work for her, now she's crying and whining. And, you know, yes, there's a genocide. Well, if you don't stand up against the genocide, there's no excuse for that. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, you stood up against genocide. Well, you shouldn't really be celebrating like you're supposed to get some kind of an award for standing against genocide. That is the minimum requirement of a human being. So just my thoughts.
All right.
I take care of my kids. I take care of my kids.
Yeah. I'll pass it to Jamal, because Jamal, another thing I noticed too, which I think frustrated me during Bernie 2020, is that I knew what the platform was really about because I was watching independent media, because I was watching people like you, you know, and et cetera. But what was frustrating was watching corporate media lie about that platform and say they want to take your healthcare away. And they would never bring on someone like you who got it right, obviously, and was supporting that, you know, the candidate at that time. They did the best that they could to try to smear him over and over. And then fast forward to 2024, we saw the same thing happening when we all knew that Joe Biden did not have it in him to have another presidential term. And Simone Sanders sat there on MSNBC and she said, Joe Biden is the candidate. There will be no primary. He's the candidate. That's it. Does everybody remember that? So it's just playing the game, just going along with it. What was that like for you, Jamal, especially being close in that area?
I've accepted that you can, integrity is expensive. You could be, you can either be right or you could be rich. It's one or the other, right? No, I had to find my job as getting it right. And you could, some of the stuff was just obvious. And mainstream media, like Joe Biden one is a really good example. If you remember, mainstream media came out, Jake Tapper specifically shouted down somebody who came on the show who pointed out that Joe Biden cognitively was not altogether there. It's like the man is literally not altogether there. He is wilting before our eyes. He's like an ice cream cone in the sun. And Jake Tapper shouts the guy down. Jake Tapper turns around and writes the book on how the media, or how, let's say, the political space hid Joe Biden's cognitive difficulties. Think about that. In one sense, he's shouting down somebody for bringing it up, and then later on writes the book on how it was hid. Like I get the sense the media is more so narrative control. It's less about what's true. It's more about the narrative that is being pushed. And whatever that narrative is, the goal is to reinforce that narrative. You get Fox News and MSNBC that ends up being the boundaries of the conversation, with CNN being the bellwether between these two groups. It doesn't mean that Fox News and MSNBC is right. It just means that these are the boundaries of the conversation. Social media has created this kind of new device, though, where that stuff gets bifurcated, or more than bifurcated. I mean, it gets split into all different directions where people have all sorts of points of view, where this kind of typical endpoints no longer they don't work anymore. And so they seem out of touch. And so Fox News, it obviously has a bias towards Republicans. MSNBC obviously has a bias towards Democrats. And you get people disbelieving all of it now. A lot of it just because they have found what media pushes to be just false. Unprovoked war of aggression, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I mean, you can go down the list of things that they effectively just made up and just ran with. And at the point where the public realizes, okay, these people are lying to us, they lose credibility. And then they blame social media. They blame Joe Rogan. They blame Donald Trump. They blame everything else, with the exception of the fact that they're just getting it wrong, and often wrong. It's frustrating, obviously. I mean, I felt like I was, oftentimes when I was doing my job, I felt like I was in an alternate reality where it's like, okay, either I'm insane because all of these people are repeating the same thing that I strongly suspect is wrong. But no, I'm not insane. I tend to get it right more often than not. Yeah, it's frustrating.
So how do people feel about those that left corporate media and they're now on this independent media podcast train? I'm going back to you, Torrin. In particular, if you look at someone like Don Lemon, or you look at, Joy Reid already has a podcast on YouTube. She started it last year. Roland Martin, who sometimes people forget, also came from corporate media and then made that journey over to YouTube and started his own thing or whatever. These people are worrisome to me because I still notice, even though they're no longer a part of those entities, they still have the corporate media talking points. They still carry water for the Democratic Party, even when they're wrong. I want to get your take about that trend that's now happening, Torrin, as well.
Well, absolutely. And I want to start by saying, as somebody who has been a frequent guest on Roland's show, I haven't been since November, but what happens, I think, is sometimes people get this idea that, like I said earlier, you forget that you're a journalist. And I'm going to speak specifically about a lot of black journalists, like you said. I think a lot of black journalists forget that they're journalists, and they end up becoming PR people for like political parties, mostly for the Democratic Party. If you're a journalist, it's your job to be objective about everybody. You know what I mean? It's your job to ask questions about everybody, whether they're Republican, whether they're Democratic, whether they're independent. Your job is to be curious, and your job is to ask questions. And I saw a lot of stuff that was leading up into the election that just passed last year, where people who I used to respect, who I thought were journalists, were so deep in the bag for the Democrats and so deep in the bag for Kamala, to the point where they were literally crashing out and screaming at people for asking simple questions about their candidate. And I'm like, aren't you a journalist? Why are you acting like this? Now, I'm kind of getting off track a little bit, but I'm saying that to say this. Like I said earlier, every black person who gets too far out of pocket in this society and think they're above everything, eventually your wake-up call is coming, and your coming to Jesus meeting is coming. And what we're seeing now is a lot of people who thought they were safe and secure. But as the brother Garland said, if the mainstream media can only use you for while you're expedient, and when it's time for you to leave, they're going to give you the boot. Like something like what happened to my sister Melissa Harris Perry. She was sort of like the canary in the coal mine for a lot of this stuff. I used to love watching Melissa Harris Perry's show, and then when it seemed like America was starting to turn more conservative, they wanted to chase that dollar. I mean, the networks wanted to chase that dollar. When they saw that conservative dollar coming in on the tail end of Obama, it's like, okay, now you got to get all you black journalists, y'all got to go find something to do because you're going to be out of here. I think what we're seeing now is the same thing happening, but the difference now is the people who are moving into independent media now are not there by choice. They're there by necessity. And what's happening is they're trying to go out here and compete with people who have been on the ground, like myself, and other people who have been out there for 10 and 12 years putting in work, and now they're trying to come home. Like you said, Don Lemon. Don Lemon's walking around like a 20-year-old YouTube, like a TikToker now with a microphone, right, trying to get people to listen to him on the street and everything. You know what I mean? I see other people who are trying to come back and do this podcast thing, where it's like, they wouldn't be caught dead in the podcast studio until they got their pink slip and told them to go get your stuff. And so it's just kind of funny seeing that. But the thing of it is, if you have a track record of shooting down people who are on the mainstream and in the grassroots, and then you try to come back out here to the grassroots and try to say, hey, I'm out here for y'all and everything, it's not going to work for you. You might get people from your group and your social circle to be with you, but we see how you move. You know, it's like, I can't believe what you say because I see how you act. So they're going to have a hard road to go trying to come back home and try to do that. It's not going to work. Number one, I think some of them are so inured with the way the mainstream works that they can't find an authentic voice in the streets, and they don't even know how to move because nobody trusts you. So I just feel like it's fascinating. But you're going to see more of that. And like the brother Garland said before, a lot of these people didn't give a damn about doing independent media until they got the boot. Now they're trying to come out here like, hey, my brother, my sister, and everything. There's a movie I tell people to see that's actually funny. It's from the 70s with Bill Cosby and Sidney Poitier. I forgot which one it was, but it's like something happens to him, and they try to go to see a black politician, and the politician got on the whole three-piece suit, and then he talks to his secretary. He says, "Are there politicians to see me? No, they're constituents." And he goes in the back, and he comes out with a dashiki on, and he's got a picture of Nixon on the wall. He flips it. There's a Malcolm X picture. And then they start playing African drums. That's what they look like to me. It's like, brothers, my brothers, how are you doing? So it's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out in the next year. I don't think it's going to work for them.
Interesting there. Garland, Angela Rye, I think is another one. I know you talked to me about it briefly. The big blowback that she got was when Jill Stein and Butch Ware came onto the Breakfast Club, and she hasn't been on at that time. She hadn't been on there as a co-host for quite some time, and all of a sudden, it was obvious that she was sent there with a specific assignment, and that was to destroy any hopes of third party, etc. That speaks to what Torrin is saying here about instead of doing journalism, it's like you're just a PR person. I want to hear your take about that.
Well,
I believe she wasn't she also let go?
Yeah, and not only that, she was a stupid one, to be quite frank, because she didn't even try to hide it. I'm sure they were angry at her saying, yeah, we sent you there to attack them, but you got to be discreet. You got to be subtle. She just came there with like a mean look on her face, like she wanted to swing at him. The only thing she didn't do is like throw things at him, right? But she came there, very violently and angrily, and you could see the game. So I think the reason she got fired was not because she didn't attack them, but because she wasn't subtle and she wasn't able to do it in a way that was so obvious. She really screwed them over because they didn't, they want the game played, but they want it played in a way where, and you can see it sometimes. You can watch the good hosts and they'll play, and it's with a smile. And there's, well, don't you think maybe we could blah, blah, blah. And they kind of nudge and they're kind of subtle about it. And those are the most dangerous, that's the most dangerous thing. The subtle ones. Hey, the ones that just come out there throwing elbows, that's easy to see. And Angela Rye, she was not good at being, they didn't want an attack dog. You know what I mean? They wanted kind of like a ninja. Kind of like somebody that was going to come in there in a black suit and you wouldn't know that they did the attack, and you walk away and your throat's been cut. You don't even know who did it or why, right? But yeah, it's sad. It's a sad state of affairs. It's something I've been commenting on for a while by saying this, and that is, it's not news. If I can turn on MSNBC or CNN and I know who they're going to attack, I know who's good, who's bad. Then I go to Fox, I know who's good. Then I go to Newsmax or Newsmax or OAN, right? And I know who's good and who's bad, right? I'm like looking at my country saying, our country has some fundamental problems when I can't turn on the news and just see, I want to see a forest fire. Don't we just have forest fires anymore? Why is it if it's a forest fire, then if it's a Republican or a Democrat, it's not the forest fire that's the story. It's what state is it in and which political party is in charge of the state, so you can attack them and blame them for the forest fire. Everything has a political tinge to it, which means we don't have media anymore. We just have outlets for the various parties. And I think what's happening, and Terrain hit it, and that is there's those of us, I've been about 3 years, who enjoy what we do. And we just get out here because we got something to say. And it's like, well, it didn't work that good on mainstream media. So I can get on, as Jamal said earlier, hey, I can get on here and say anything I want, and there'll be somebody that likes it. And if not, there won't be that many people, but I get to say it. And one of the things we have to be careful of now is this: the Don Lemons and his ilk, people who didn't make it in the, either didn't make it in the mainstream media. Let me be a little conspiracy theorist here. Also, I think that the mainstream wants to infiltrate this sphere. And they want to get people in here and give the appearance that they're alternative media. And we know who they are. There's some people I look at it and I'm like, you look like you're sitting in your bedroom or something with some curtains in the back, right? But when I listen to what you're saying, I might as well be listening to CNN. So they want to, there's people out here that want to create the appearance of alternative media, but what you're hearing out of their mouth is it's the same old thing. And I feel it's the mainstream trying to infiltrate here and get over here and take all of our people, but it ain't going to work, because the people that are in the chat right now, the people that are watching our shows, they're there for the realness of it, and they know when it ain't real. Intuitively, they know what's real and what's not. That's why they left them, and that's the good thing about it.
Those are really good points there, Garland. I wonder about that too, them trying to infiltrate like this space. And speaking of infiltration, this is another thing that has come up over the past, I think, couple of months. There has also been scrutiny towards corporate media taking a liking to certain people that do not have experience in the political space, but giving them a lot of room to speak. So, for example, I'm sure you guys have seen it. Charlemagne the God and Stephen A. Smith. I'm passing it to you, Jamal Thomas. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, and everybody noticed this, all of a sudden, when it started in the 2024 presidential election, everybody wants to know all these, whether it's MSNBC, CNN, even Fox News, etc., The View, they want to, let's bring on Charlemagne the God and Stephen A. Smith and get their political opinion. Stephen A. Smith is an amazing, sports commentator. I watched him for years on First Take, ESPN, etc. I do agree with some of his takes about where the Democrats have messed up. I don't agree with all of his takes, but he's not a political commentator. But they're bringing on people like Stephen A. and Charlemagne the God for political commentary. Jamal.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that. I mean, Charlemagne seemed to get a huge amount of presence in the 2024 election. Initially, he was screaming at Joe Biden, saying that Joe Biden, he doesn't automatically get my vote, all this other stuff. And then when Kamala Harris came on, all of a sudden he was a lock. And for Kamala Harris, it was very bizarre. It was very strange turnover. I would have loved somebody to ask him, what's the difference politically? Like, what policy-wise, what's the difference? Kamala Harris made a choice not to unmoor herself to Joe Biden. So how are you so in the tank for one, but not in the tank for the other? Yeah, I think you have a point. Oh man, I get the sense that it's Black voices that are critical of Democrats, but are still kind of Democrats, if that makes sense. Like Charlemagne the God is a Democrat for all intents and purposes. He was in the tank for Joe Biden. Stephen A. Smith is not a Republican by any stretch of the imagination. He just has criticism of the party and the way that the party currently operates. And I agree with you. There's some stuff I agree with him, but when he put a knife in the View, I agreed with him. But there are other stuff that he would say what I would not necessarily go with. I don't know what's going on with this. I mean, because I do see it. I just don't necessarily know the motivation behind propping up voices like this. I mean, Charlemagne has started getting a lot of headplay in general, especially in the political space. I don't know what's going on with it. Maybe because he has political commentary every random blue moon, or he would bring on political figures like he brought on Joe Biden, he brought on Harris, he brought on Jill Stein, even though, that was somewhat of an ambush. So every random blue moon, he does have a tendency to bring on some political figures. But I agree with you. These aren't necessarily political commentators. They just have a point of view. I don't know. I don't know the motivation behind it. Raising those voices, I guess that's my point. That's my honest answer with it.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people don't know this, but back in the day, I'm not going to say how long ago, but back in the day, Charlemagne was my best friend's neighbor.
Was he?
That's back when yes, back when I was an undergrad, when he was still on the radio in Columbia, South Carolina.
That's so random.
Old school. Yep, that's back in the day. So this was never really.
Did he do political commentary at all during the radio days when he was in South Carolina?
No, this was more like hip hop, sometimes like pop culture. And then I still remember when he got the call, when he said that he was going to move to New York to go do the Wendy Williams radio show. So this is when Wendy Williams was still on the radio right before she got the talk show.
Right.
So his move from Columbia, South Carolina was to go work with Wendy Williams on the radio show. And then I guess like when she got the talk show offer, that's when he went over to the Breakfast Club and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, this goes way back. Like I know like that's way back when he was on like local radio a long time ago. But again, was not into like politics in this way, shape or form. But that also brings me to the final question I want to ask everybody, which is about independent media, because another thing, we have these call-ins once a week. And one of the things that's been brought to my attention about particularly Black media is people are starting to notice, at least my viewers are starting to notice, that they want to know why they're not seeing more of the Black media voices on independent media. The people who already exist, like people like yourself, they want to know why they're not seeing you guys on like a TYT, why they're not seeing you guys on like a Breaking Point. And I want to get your perspective about that. We'll go to Torn and we'll make our way around.
Oh, it's a very simple question, because they have their designated Black people that they bring on, and they stick in that and they stay in those circles. And if you're outside of that circle, they don't really understand you, or they don't want to hear from you. There's also the fact that we have to talk about scale as well, because a lot of times when you're independent and Black, a lot of your time is trying to figure out how to get stories, present those stories, and also try to figure out funding. So when you have all that going on, a lot of times you don't have time to really try to submit yourself to be on there, because as everybody on this on the panel knows, sometimes you have to like submit yourself to be considered to be on some of these shows. But at the same time, when you're dealing with somebody like a Young Church or a Rising like that, they have people who research. And I tell people all the time, these people sit around on social media. They have interns that sit around and see who's hot when it comes to Black media. And they pick and choose who they want. But to answer your question simply, it's like they get their 1 or 2 Black people. They have them on a continuous basis, and they don't step out of that paradigm because they know what they're going to say.
Garland.
Third rails. That's what it is. I think it's third rails. They know people who won't avoid the third rails. I can't come on. They don't want me to come on there and say certain things about Gaza or certain, okay, let's talk about Ukraine, and I can say certain things about that. You know what I mean? Foreign policy. There's third rails that you just can't step on, right? And they know that there are those of us in the alternative media that we kind of live on the third rail. You know what I mean? That's why we have some success, because they won't touch the third rails. And our whole game is not game, but you know what I mean? Our whole thing is, look, it's critical that we talk about things that the mainstream media won't talk about. And that's why people may like our particular shows. And those are the type of people, they're like, well, we know if we bring this dude on, he's going right to the things that like the people behind us will be like, get this guy off. Let's pretend they're going to be yanking plugs out, trying to pretend like, they had a power outage in a community or something. So I think that's a big part of it, because you, me, Jamal, all of us, we don't have third rails. In fact, I would argue that's why people like us, because like when something happens that we know the mainstream media can't possibly touch, that's the first thing we're going to talk about. And that's why people come to our shows, because they're like, well, you used to be turning on Fox or CNN. They'll never talk about that. Let me see what Sabrina has to say, because I know that's what they know before they even go to your channel. That's going to be the big, the number one show.
Jamal.
Yeah.
And one question for you also with this, Jamal, is there a rejection to anti-imperialist voices?
Yes, obviously. Yes. Look, think of the hell Donald Trump is going through right now. And, think of Bernie Sanders, the warmonger, screaming, look, I don't take issue if people go after Donald Trump, especially on the left, for the things that he's doing domestically. God bless. It's atrocious, right? I don't have issues with him putting the screws to the CIA, but firing all of these government workers, going after these programs, going after Medicaid, trying to just basically effectively destroy the state in the way that state apparatus works. All of that's atrocious, right? But the notion that there will be so loud voices trying to stop him ending a war is outrageous. Especially people who consider themselves lefties and who consider themselves, I am anti-war. However, I want to keep this war going because Donald Trump is the one that's trying to end it. It's outrageous, right? And so you have to scream very loud. It's the orthodoxy is to be okay with this stuff. An unprovoked war of aggression, a revolution of dignity. It's cool, right? If you think of Brian Williams, where he was effectively touching himself on air when Trump fired off the missiles into Syria. Okay, how is the president justifying doing this? And yet, Brian Williams would not ask the question, how is the president justified in doing this? For him, this is the moment that Trump seemed presidential to me. It's like it's like a guiding star. They never took issue with Joe Biden in the things that he was doing in regards to the escalations. Zero issue with it at all. The fact that it could start a third world war, no issue. Like there is a North Star in regards to the way, let's say, the media and the political space work. And they are perfectly okay with more war. And so it is like, imagine a person going on CNN and saying, hey, maybe we should stop the war. Okay, that's rare. If you think of the run-up to the Ukraine war, there was no voices saying calm down or back away. If you remember, the progressives put out the letter effectively saying, hey, we should be working towards peace, not necessarily working towards escalating war. They pulled that letter in one day. One day they pulled that letter after they're being thoroughly chastised for having the temerity to even say, hey, maybe we should be working towards peace as opposed to more conflict. So yeah, I think part of it is anti-imperial voices. I think the other one is Garland is right. They don't, they know who they're bringing on when they bring them on. And, I watched Malik on CNN. Malik, my co-host, he was on, he's been on CNN. He's been doing good work. Granted, he's Republican, but whatever. He's been doing good work for a Republican. They are trash on foreign policy issues. It's so it's so like very surface. There's no context given to how something happened. There's a lot of dropping the ball or hiding the ball when they're talking about various stories. Oftentimes they're bringing on people from the CIA, neocons, FBI, etc. They have a very specific point of view that they tend to push on these issues, and bringing on somebody like Garland, myself, who would try to add context to it, is not part of the script. So no, I don't have an expectation that I'd get a call from CNN.
They fired Tucker Carlson. They fired Tucker Carlson, and he was like had the best numbers on all of, because he brought on people that would say, "Hey, Julian Assange should be let go." You're out of here, buddy.
Yep. Edward Snowden, maybe it wasn't unprovoked. Like he would say that stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong. Tucker Carlson would also say stuff like, "Hey, what's wrong with having a white capital? Why can't we just have a place where only white people can be?" Right? He'd say stuff, random stuff like that. But he would also question this kind of orthodoxy of foreign policy in a way that I approve, frankly.
All right. Well, everyone, before you go, can you please let everybody know how they can follow your work? We'll go back up to Torrin.
Well, you can follow my work on Twitter, Torrin Walker. You can also follow me on my YouTube channel, Torrin Walker TV. You can also check out my Substack if you want to see my long form written work. torrinwalker.substack.com. You notice a trend there, everybody. And also, if you want to check out some of my other stuff, I'm always on Twitter a lot. I'm probably on there maybe more than I need to be, but you can always find my stuff there.
Awesome. Garland.
Same thing. Garland Nixon on, I'm on, not on Twitter. That's a whole nother story, but I'm on YouTube and Rumble and Rockfin and Facebook, Instagram, at Garland in on Telegram. So, and I'm on YouTube every day. I'm throwing something out there with somebody.
And Jamal.
I'm on Twitter. My Twitter account is been reestablished after being stolen for the last several months. So thankfully that's back on. At Jamal Thomas, but also on YouTube under the Jamal Thomas channel. The Jamal Thomas Morning Show. It comes on from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. Monday through Friday.
All right. Okay. Thank you guys so much. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.